It started out like any other quiet Saturday morning. The kind where you wake up early not because you have to, but because the weather's too perfect to waste. The sky was clear, the sun warm, and for once, the neighborhood was unusually still. After grabbing my coffee and pacing around my backyard, I figured it was finally the perfect time to tackle a project I'd been putting off for weeks, draining the pool. It wasn't a quick decision. I'd already checked the local water regulations, confirmed the drain-off zone, and even notified the HOA a week ago out of courtesy, though I didn't technically need their permission. Still, I like to keep things clean and professional. Little did I know that courtesy would be completely ignored, and today would spiral into the kind of drama you only see on online forums or exaggerated HOA horror stories. I turned on the pump around 8 a.m., watching the water begin to swirl and lower inch by inch. I had no music playing, no tools banging, just a slow, quiet draining process. Even the birds seemed relaxed. I was planning to deep clean the tile lining and maybe refill it by evening if things went smoothly. It felt good to finally get around to something I've been meaning to do for so long. But peace in a neighborhood with a particularly aggressive HOA was always short-lived, especially when one of its most enthusiastic members happened to live 2 doors down. Karen. She had a reputation. Not the fun, quirky kind of reputation either, the kind that came with surveillance cameras pointed in all directions and a clipboard that she carried like a weapon. Karen wasn't just a neighbor, she was the neighbor. The one who sniffed out violations like a bloodhound and reported grass that was 1 inch too long. So when I heard the sound of footsteps charging across gravel followed by a gasp that was meant to be heard, I knew before I even turned around who it was. There she stood, sunglasses on, phone already in hand, mouth wide open as if I had just committed a crime against humanity itself. "You can't do that," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the pool pump. I calmly turned it off and asked what exactly she thought I was doing. She scoffed, like I had asked the dumbest question ever, and launched into a rapid-fire speech about environmental waste, property devaluation, and potential flooding issues that had supposedly affected the Johnsons 3 streets down. I reminded her that I had followed all protocols and that I was well within my rights to drain and maintain my pool. But logic was never Karen's strong suit. She waved her phone like a badge, threatening to call the HOA and the police if I didn't stop immediately. Now, I've lived in this house long enough to know when someone is bluffing. But Karen wasn't bluffing. Not this time. She stormed off mid-sentence, and within 15 minutes, I saw the familiar sight of a black and white patrol car crawling down the road. At first, I thought surely not. But sure enough, the car stopped right in front of my driveway. 2 officers stepped out, one with a notepad and the other with a look of boredom that told me this wasn't their first Karen-related call. I greeted them politely and asked what the issue was. One officer explained that they'd received a call about unauthorized water drainage and a possible hazard to neighborhood infrastructure. The way he said it, you could tell he didn't believe a word of it, but he was obligated to check it out. I walked them around, showed them the setup, the hose leading to the storm drain that complied with city guidelines, and the printed notice I'd emailed to the HOA the week prior. While I spoke with the officers, Karen hovered from her yard like a villain in a soap opera, loudly interjecting and waving her arms. She was desperate to get their attention, throwing in wild accusations about damage to community property and how I was risking everyone's safety. I noticed a few neighbors peeking through their blinds. Others had come outside, probably drawn by the squad car and Karen's voice echoing through the neighborhood. At that point, the situation had officially turned from a routine cleaning to a full-blown neighborhood spectacle. And it was all over a pool. A pool on my private property that I paid taxes on, that I maintained myself, and that I had every legal right to drain. The moment the officers left, giving me a nod that clearly said, "Hang in there," I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it. But with Karen, there's never just one act in the play. Just as I turned to get back to finishing the job, I heard the sound of high heels clacking aggressively on concrete. It was the kind of sound that warned you trouble was coming, and sure enough, there she was, storming straight across the sidewalk, sunglasses still on, clipboard now in hand. She didn't say a word at first, just stood there, hands on her hips, glaring at me like I had vandalized a national monument. Then she started in again, this time louder, more theatrical, and with a strange sense of entitlement that made it seem like she believed she had legal ownership over my backyard. Karen began her tirade with accusations that I was personally disrespecting her and the community. She said things like, "People like you think the rules don't apply, and it's residents like you who bring the whole neighborhood down." I was almost impressed by how quickly she escalated from HOA gossip to personal attacks. Her voice carried so well that a few more neighbors poked their heads out. One across the street actually brought out a folding chair and sat on their porch, popcorn in hand. Karen didn't care. She thrived on the audience. And with the police gone, she saw an opportunity to regain control of the scene by sheer force of volume. She started flipping through her clipboard like a lawyer preparing for trial, pulling out what she claimed was a copy of the HOA guidelines. She pointed to a section about exterior modifications, storm drainage, and property maintenance, twisting the vague language to somehow prove that draining a pool was not only a violation, but a safety hazard. I asked her calmly to show me exactly where it said I couldn't do what I was doing, and she snapped back with, "You wouldn't understand the nuance. That's why people like me have to step up and enforce the rules." It was incredible how she managed to inflate her own role from nosy neighbor to self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood law. Then came the threats. She said she would report me not only to the HOA board, but to the environmental department of the city. She made it sound like I was dumping toxic waste into the water supply instead of just draining clean chlorinated water through a legal outlet. She accused me of setting a bad example for newer residents, warning that if people started seeing me bend the rules, soon everyone would follow suit and the whole community would go downhill. It wasn't about the water. It wasn't even about the pool. It was about control. Karen needed to be the one in charge of how everyone lived their lives, even when it had nothing to do with her. I stayed calm. I always do in situations like this. That's what frustrates people like her the most, when they can't provoke you into losing your temper. She paced back and forth, waving her clipboard around like a sword, citing half-remembered bylaws and fabricating new ones as she went. She even tried to take pictures of my backyard from her phone, dramatically leaning over the property line to get the evidence she needed. I asked her to step back, reminding her that she was now bordering on trespassing, and that if she took one more step, I'd have no choice but to report her. That stopped her for about 3 seconds before she blurted out something about how I didn't belong in a community like this, and how she was going to make sure I was dealt with at the next HOA meeting. At that point, a few more neighbors came out, not to support her, but to ask her if everything was okay, with just enough sarcasm to make it clear they were tired of her antics too. One neighbor even asked if she needed a glass of water, which only made her more furious. She yelled that I was causing division in the neighborhood, that this was a once peaceful place until I moved in and started doing things my own way. It became clear that this wasn't just about the pool. This was about Karen feeling like she was losing control over a place she had spent years dominating through fear, intimidation, and relentless emails. Her voice began to shake, not from fear, but from the frustration of realizing that the crowd wasn't on her side this time. Just when I thought the spectacle was starting to wind down and Karen would eventually tire herself out, the situation escalated in a way that even I didn't fully expect. After our heated exchange in front of a growing audience of curious neighbors, Karen stomped back to her house in a theatrical flurry, barking into her phone with furious energy. I assumed she was calling the HOA board again, maybe a friend to vent to, or worse, trying to dig up some city code she could twist in her favor. But within the hour, she proved just how far she was willing to go to feel powerful. As I stood by the pool pump, double-checking the drainage, I heard sirens again. Not the distant kind you usually ignore, but the close, unmistakable wail of police returning to a scene. I walked to the front of the house, and there it was, another patrol car, different officers this time, pulling up to the curb. I froze for a second, part disbelief, part pure annoyance. I hadn't broken a single law. I hadn't even raised my voice. I'd done everything by the book. And yet, here they were again, because Karen had doubled down on her crusade. One of the officers stepped out and politely asked to speak with me. His tone was neutral but firm, the kind of voice you use when you're not sure what kind of person you're dealing with. I nodded and led him toward the backyard, trying to keep calm, though inside, my frustration was bubbling. When I asked what this was about, he said the department had received a second complaint, this time stating there was potential for environmental damage, water code violations, and even unsafe conditions for children and pets. The last part nearly made me laugh, but the officer wasn't joking. Karen had clearly crafted an entire narrative around my simple act of draining a swimming pool. According to her, the runoff was potentially contaminating the street, my actions were irresponsible, and I was putting the neighborhood at risk. It was ridiculous, but I knew the officer was just doing his job, so I walked him through everything again. I pointed out the same storm drain, the same legal runoff zone, and handed over the same documentation I had shown the first patrol. I even had an email printout where I had informed the HOA of my maintenance schedule. While the officer inspected the area, Karen reappeared like clockwork. This time she didn't stay on her property. She marched right over, arms folded, lips tight, and tone sharp. She launched into her monologue before anyone could stop her. She demanded that the officer issue a citation, claiming that the neighborhood standards were at stake. She insisted I was violating property boundaries, creating a public nuisance, and potentially committing a misdemeanor. The sheer level of drama was surreal. She had turned a personal annoyance into a legal matter and seemed to truly believe she was saving the community from some massive threat. To his credit, the officer asked her to step back and let him conduct his inspection. Karen looked offended, as if he had just taken away her authority. She began pacing again, this time on the sidewalk, talking loudly about how she knew people at City Hall and would make sure this didn't go unnoticed. She mentioned water conservation laws, drought emergencies, and how her friend in another HOA once got fined thousands for similar behavior. Every reference she made was vague, half-remembered, and clearly twisted to fit the story she was building. The second officer, who had stayed in the car, eventually joined us and took a few photos of the setup. He asked questions about the duration of the draining, where the water was going, and whether I'd used any chemicals prior to draining. I answered each question calmly and thoroughly. I had nothing to hide, and frankly, I was getting tired of having to prove it over and over again. Karen kept interjecting, asking the officers if they could issue a cease and desist order, or if there was a way to shut down the pump immediately. At one point, she even suggested that the police bring in someone from environmental services. What struck me the most was the desperation in her voice. This wasn't just about me draining a pool anymore. This was about Karen trying to reassert dominance in a situation where she was losing control. She had already called once and been dismissed. This second call was her attempt to reclaim power, to prove to the neighborhood that she was still the one who could make things happen, who could bring in authority figures and create consequences. Even as the officers quietly conferred and began to wrap up, she stood there defiantly, convinced she had done the right thing. The two officers took their time walking through my property, inspecting the area like seasoned professionals who had done this sort of thing more times than they could count. I stayed close, answering their questions with patience, repeating information I had already provided in the first visit. I could tell they were just being thorough, likely aware that Karen had already wasted enough of their time, but still wanting to ensure every box was checked in case this somehow got escalated further. I pointed out again that the water was being drained directly into the storm system via a clearly marked, city-approved runoff route. No chemicals had been added to the pool in the last few weeks. In fact, I had specifically waited to drain it until I was certain it was clean enough not to cause any disruption. One of the officers nodded in understanding, even complimenting how cleanly the operation was being handled. He even mentioned that many homeowners make the mistake of draining water directly into the yard, which can erode soil or run off into neighboring properties. Karen overheard that comment from her side of the fence and scoffed loudly, as if hearing something that contradicted her entire argument was too much for her to bear. She stepped forward once again, demanding to know what would be done about the violation. The officer calmly explained that nothing illegal was happening and that everything appeared to be compliant with local laws. That was the first moment I saw her composure really falter. She began to argue, not just passionately, but desperately. She flipped through her clipboard again, and this time pulled out printouts, probably HOA newsletters or fragments of city codes she found online, all wildly out of context. She tried to cite water waste ordinances, quoting drought enforcement rules that weren't even active in our county. She even pointed to a photo on her phone she had taken from behind a tree, claiming it showed excess water flooding into the street, even though the picture clearly just showed a small damp area on the sidewalk near the curb. One officer took a glance and handed her phone back without saying much. The silence hit her harder than a direct rebuttal. At that point, the senior officer turned to me and asked if I had copies of the HOA rules. I told him I had the full digital copy on my phone, as well as the original email chain where I had informed the HOA about the drainage in advance. I pulled it up and handed it over. He read through it carefully, scanning the bullet points that confirmed pool maintenance was allowed as long as it didn't damage public or private property. There was no language banning drainage into the storm system, and no clause requiring specific HOA approval unless structural changes were being made. He nodded and handed the phone back. Karen was still fuming, still trying to argue that even if it wasn't illegal, it was unethical, that I was being selfish and endangering the look and feel of the neighborhood. She said things like, even if the city allows it, we have a higher standard, and that's not how things have always been done here. She kept saying we, as if she spoke for the entire neighborhood, but by now it was clear to everyone watching that she was standing alone. The officer turned to her and told her as gently as he could that there were no violations present and that the matter did not require further investigation. He suggested that if she had an issue with HOA guidelines, she should take it up with the board directly, not the police department. I could feel the weight of Karen's frustration intensify in that moment. Her arms crossed tighter, her jaw clenched, and for a second, it looked like she might explode. But instead, she muttered something under her breath and stormed back toward her house. The second officer offered a slight smile, as if to say, "You handled that better than most would," and returned to the car. They drove away, leaving a kind of stunned silence in their wake. A few neighbors, still lingering nearby, glanced around awkwardly before going back inside. The show was over, and it hadn't gone the way Karen had expected. I walked back to my pump, feeling equal parts relieved and exhausted. The confrontation had taken up most of the morning, turning what should have been a quiet maintenance day into a full-blown legal standoff. Still, I had done everything by the book, and that mattered. What struck me most was how much effort Karen had put into turning a simple task into a neighborhood crisis. It wasn't enough for her to disagree quietly or even voice a concern through official channels. She needed to weaponize rules, summon law enforcement, and manipulate perception just to feel like she was in control. As the officers pulled away and the last of the spectators faded back into their homes, the atmosphere shifted. The tension in the air hadn't completely disappeared, but the sense of looming threat had certainly eased. I went back to my task with renewed focus, still annoyed but determined to finish what I started. The pool was already halfway drained by then, and the remaining water lazily swirled around the shallow end. What should have been a peaceful afternoon project had morphed into a neighborhood showdown, and the fallout was far from over. Karen was nowhere to be seen for a while. Her windows were shut, her front door closed tight, and for the first time that day, her yard was silent. That silence didn't last long. Just before sunset, I noticed a few members of the HOA board walking down the sidewalk. They weren't coming in a group, but rather trickling toward my house one by one, some clearly uneasy, others mildly curious. I greeted them all with the same calm demeanor I'd used with the police earlier. The board president, Mr. Langford, stepped forward and introduced himself politely, holding a folder under his arm and a very diplomatic expression on his face. He said he'd received a formal concern from a fellow HOA member about my pool maintenance and wanted to verify what had taken place. I nodded and invited him to walk the yard with me. As we walked, I explained everything again, my intent to clean and maintain the pool, the safe drainage into the storm system, my notification to the HOA a week prior. I handed him the printed copy of the email and pointed to the runoff area, still just damp earth and no sign of flooding or erosion. He nodded slowly as he examined the setup, clearly taking mental notes, but I could sense he wasn't here to punish. He was here to contain the drama. When we finished our lap, I asked plainly whether there had been an official complaint or if this was just a formality. He hesitated before replying. Then he admitted that Karen had called 3 times and emailed 7 board members within 2 hours of the incident. Her emails were long, filled with accusations, warnings, and links to irrelevant city codes. He said most of the board members were aware of her persistence and that they had taken her concerns seriously out of obligation, not necessarily agreement. Some of them had even joked about placing a Karen clause in the HOA charter to deal with repeat exaggerators. I asked if I had done anything wrong, and Mr. Langford shook his head. He said as far as the board was concerned, I had followed all appropriate procedures, and no rule had been broken. But then he added something more interesting. He said that several neighbors had called or messaged the board during the confrontation, not to complain about me, but about Karen. Some had recorded parts of the exchange. Others had voiced concern about her behavior, and at least one had forwarded footage of her stepping onto my property and taking photos uninvited. The board had apparently received enough informal complaints about her over the past year to begin discussing internal guidelines for member conduct. This incident, it seemed, had been the final push. Mr. Langford flipped open his folder and showed me a printed summary of HOA expectations, what he called a courtesy memo about respectful neighbor interaction. He said this would be distributed to the entire community next week as a gentle reminder about boundaries and civility. Though my name wasn't mentioned anywhere, it was clear the memo was born from this very event. Later that evening, I received a knock at the door. It was another board member, an older woman named Denise who lived at the other end of the block. She handed me a plate of cookies, smiled, and apologized on behalf of the neighborhood. She said most of the residents were aware of Karen's tactics and were quietly rooting for someone to finally stand their ground. She had watched everything from her driveway and said the way I handled the situation, calm, factual, and unshaken, was exactly what was needed to remind everyone that the HOA didn't exist for power-hungry neighbors to abuse. Karen's house remained dark through the evening. No movement, no barking, not even a usual click of her security camera adjusting on its motor. The neighborhood, on the other hand, seemed to breathe a little easier. A few neighbors passed by and waved. Some even struck up small talk about gardening or upcoming HOA meetings. It was the kind of normal, casual interaction that had been missing for a while. There was a shift in energy, subtle but real, like the tight grip Karen had maintained on the community had started to loosen. Her actions, meant to punish and control, had only turned the spotlight back on herself. The following week unfolded with a strange quiet across the neighborhood. After the chaos Karen had stirred up, it was almost eerie how subdued everything had become. The tension that used to linger in the air, that constant sense of being watched, judged, reported, had thinned out, almost like the atmosphere itself had relaxed. The HOA didn't hold an emergency meeting as Karen probably hoped. No one came knocking with fines or warnings. What had happened, however, was something far more impactful and long overdue. The HOA board issued a community-wide newsletter. Unlike the usual seasonal updates and reminders about trash pickup, this one had a more serious tone. Nestled in between a note about summer lawn care and reminders about mailbox maintenance was a new section titled Community Respect and Conduct. It was written in careful, formal language, but the message was unmistakable. It emphasized the importance of neighborly behavior, discouraged misuse of emergency services for non-criminal disputes, and reminded residents that HOA rules were to be enforced through formal board channels only, not personal crusades. The part that stood out most was a reminder that harassment or intimidation, even under the guise of rule enforcement, could be ground for disciplinary review. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew what, and who, the section was about. The wording was clearly designed to de-escalate future incidents and to give the board a way to finally push back against behavior that had become a source of dread for many. Over the next few days, I received more waves and nods from neighbors than I had in the past 6 months combined. It was like I had unwittingly become the guy who took the first punch and stayed standing, and people respected that. Some of them even stopped by during my afternoon yard work just to say how glad they were someone had stood up to her. They all had their own stories: threats over lawn height, angry emails about holiday decorations, complaints filed over fence paint. One neighbor, Mr. Hall, said that a few years ago, Karen had tried to get his garden beds banned because she didn't like the color of the mulch. Another, a young couple 2 houses down, admitted they had been close to selling their home after Karen tried to have their home office setup cited as a zoning violation. It was like a dam had broken. People were finally speaking openly about what they'd quietly endured. The thing is, no one had ever really pushed back hard enough or with enough legitimacy to cause the board to act. Until now. Karen, on the other hand, had clearly taken the blow hard. She was still in the neighborhood, but she kept to herself in a way that was completely uncharacteristic. Her car was rarely seen outside. Her curtains stayed drawn. For a woman who had once proudly paraded through the streets like she was sheriff of a tiny HOA town, her absence spoke volumes. The fact that she hadn't responded publicly or tried to spin the situation in her favor was proof that the message had landed, not just from a board, but from the neighborhood itself. One afternoon, I saw her walking her dog around the block. She kept her head down and made a point of avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially me. A few weeks earlier, she would have approached me with accusations, complaints, or one of her infamous printed-out bylaws. But now, she barely glanced in my direction before crossing the street. There was no shouting, no threats, no clipboard. Just a quiet walk and the unmistakable look of someone who had finally been forced to confront the fact that her power wasn't as absolute as she thought. The HOA board sent out a follow-up notice shortly afterward. It included a new process for submitting complaints. Everything had to go through a standardized online form, with clear evidence and no anonymous submissions. They added a policy that multiple baseless complaints within a 90-day period could trigger a review of the submitter's HOA standing. Again, no names were mentioned, but the target was crystal clear. Karen's behavior had not just crossed a line. It had forced the HOA to draw new ones. What started as a simple project to clean my pool had turned into something much bigger. I hadn't expected to make a point or take a stand, but in handling the situation calmly and sticking to the facts, I ended up doing exactly that. More importantly, it showed everyone that the HOA system, as frustrating as it can be, doesn't have to be dominated by one loud voice or manipulated through fear. It can be reclaimed. Boundaries can be redrawn. Respect can be demanded not just in bylaws, but in how we live alongside one another.